Hi boys and girls, welcome to reading. This week in reading we're talking about the genre called narrative nonfiction. It's when an author writes about something from real life, something that has happened or happens in the world, about animals or people. We talked about, there was a story of scientists. You could read a narrative nonfiction about firefighters or just anything that's happening in real life. Now here's a form of that story which is really fun we want to talk about today, which is called personal narrative. Now, if you wrote a story about yourself, it would be a personal narrative. And if it's about yourself, that's real life, isn't it? So that's a really fun thing that we can do, and we're going to do that. We're going to talk about it first before we get to that, before we actually write a personal narrative. And we're on page 87 of our My View, 87. And we're going to talk about a few parts of a story. And when we write about ourselves, we have to remember how that's going to look. Okay, so we're going to talk about setting, and the next couple pages we're talking about the narrator and plot. Okay, now let's go ahead and start on page 87, and we're talking about a setting. The setting is where and when a narrative takes place. The setting is where and when a story takes place, whether it's a story about yourself or someone else. There's always a setting, okay? And now, if we take a look at these three pictures, these are three settings. Now, these are more about where. I see a rocket ship. Where's this at? This is above the Earth, above the atmosphere, headed to space. A really exciting place, right? Here's another place, a place we may know more, may be more familiar with. That's a playground. We see that a lot. And then finally, a campground. Where's this at? This is probably in the woods, somewhere like that. Okay. Now, when would these take place? Well, they could really take place anytime. They could be now. These could be in the past. Maybe in the future with that one. But this part of the setting, we're talking more about where. So, going into space, a playground, or in the woods camping. Now, in a personal narrative, the setting is a real place that you have been to at a real time. So, if you're going to write a story about yourself, the setting would have to be a place that you have been to. So now we're going to take a look at these three things, think about these things, and we're going to circle the settings that we could have in our story about ourselves in our personal narrative. And so basically, we have to see which ones we could write about. So let's think about where have you been? Have you been here? I don't know about you. If you have, wow, that's awesome. Probably not. I haven't been here. Most people I know have not been here. We're not astronauts. So go ahead and put an X on this one. This could not be our setting in our personal narrative. If we're writing about ourselves, we can't write about space, unless you've been to space. But I don't think anybody in this class, whether here at school or at home, has been to space. So I crossed that one out. The next one, playground. Could that be a setting in a story about you? In a personal narrative about yourself? Yeah. I think so, right? You've been to a playground. I've been to a playground. I'm going to circle that. That could be a setting in our personal narrative and a story about ourselves. How about camping? This could be kind of split. Now, I'm going to go ahead and circle that because I've been camping and I've been to the woods. You may not have been, and that's okay. Maybe you would put an X on there. You say, well, I want to go camping one day. I've never been. Or you could circle and say, yes, I have been camping. It was a lot of fun. So circle it if you've been there. Put an X if you haven't. And now, after you do that, you can take a look. Maybe you just have this one, and you have only one place that you have been to on here, which is totally fine. And you have just one circle. Or maybe you have this one and that one. I doubt you have this one, right? All right, so that is setting. That is the setting, the place and when, where and when in a story. Now, let's turn the page. Let's go to page 88. All right, so here on page 88, we're talking about the narrator. The narrator is the person who is telling the story. The narrator tells about the people, setting, and events. Okay, so the narrator in a personal narrative is usually the author. So if you're going to tell a story about yourself, you're going to be the narrator. You're going to say, well, me and my mom and dad, we went camping with my brother and sister, and you're speaking from yourself about your life, so you're the narrator. You're telling the story. Now, in your personal narrative, in a story about yourself, who could you be talking about? Who could you be talking about? What type of person could you be talking about? You could be talking about yourself. You could be talking about people you know, your friends, your mom or dad, grandma, grandpa, people like that. Let's take a look at some people here and imagine, could you be talking about them in the story about your life? How about this guy? Who's this guy? That's the king. He's the king of where? I don't know, but he's the king. Do you know a king? If you're telling a story about your life, could you talk about a king? Well, I couldn't. I'm going to put an X for me. I've never met a real king. Maybe you have. And maybe you have been to some faraway land and you've met a real king. But I never have. So I'm going to put an X. You probably are going to put an X too, unless you've actually met a king. If you've met a king and you're telling a story about your life, you can go ahead and circle that. Okay? Now, next one. This is a little girl playing soccer. Have you ever met someone playing soccer? A little girl playing soccer? Yeah, I have. So I'm going to circle that one. In a story about my life, I could tell a story about my niece. She played soccer. And I could tell a story about going to her soccer game. Okay? Now, if you have never met anyone, a little girl that's played soccer, let's say you're a little girl and you've never played soccer, or you don't know any girls that have played soccer, you would put an X there. Because that, you could not put that in a story about your life. Here's an empty box right here. Who else could you talk about in a story about yourself? You could talk about your mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, cousins, friends, a lot of people. So draw a picture, and you can pause the video. Go ahead and draw a picture of somebody that you could talk about in a story about your life. Okay? So I'm going to do a really quick drawing. I'm going to draw my grandpa, and I'm going to draw him. Now you can take a lot more time than this. I'm just going to do a quick one, just to give a quick example. This is my grandpa. He was a really great guy, and he would be in a story about my life. Me and my two sisters growing up, we went to the mall with my grandpa a lot when he came to visit. So that's a picture of my grandpa. I could tell a story about that. Okay, so who could you tell a story about in your life? All right, so pause the video, draw that picture. All right, and now we're going to finish this study of personal narrative, story about our lives. Composed plot. The plot, we're on the next page, 89. The plot is the main events in a narrative. Okay? Basically what happens, the main events in a narrative. What takes place? Events can tell about a problem and a resolution. Okay? So, for instance, there could be a story, I could tell a story that when I was a little kid, there was a store called Kmart. And we used to go to Kmart. It's kind of like Walmart, but a little bit different. Well, a lot of times when we went to Kmart as a family, I would get lost. So I would wander away from my parents. Don't ever do that. It's not good. And my mom and dad would say, stay close, and I wouldn't listen. I'd go look for toys. So I would get really sad. I'd be crying. I'd go to the front of the store, and they would turn on a speaker, and they would say, if there is a parent of a little boy, come get your boy. His name is Eric. And so my parents would come up, and I'd be crying and hug them. So the problem was I would get lost at Kmart. The resolution was, or a solution or resolution, was that they would come to the front and pick me up. So there's a problem and a resolution. Here's another one. What if you went to the playground and you went to on a slide that was really, really too high? There's a problem. What's the resolution? You don't want to slide down. You feel too scared to slide down. Well, you figure it out. You can just turn around and go back and go down the ladder and go back to the ground. That would be a resolution. Let's say that your dog got lost. He left your house, and that's the problem in your story. And oh my goodness, what's going to happen? That's a really interesting story. Well, the resolution is we kept looking, and we finally found him. So a problem, a lot of times a personal narrative, story about you, has a problem and a resolution. That makes it really interesting, actually. So here is a picture. What is this picture of? Spilled milk, right? That's a problem. I'm glad that's not carpet. If that's carpet, oh no, your mom and dad might be really upset because it's hard to get up and it smells bad. But anyways, that's a problem to have when you have milk that spills. What would be a resolution? What could you draw here that would show a resolution? Well, I would draw, for instance, maybe a mop. This looks like a solid floor, not carpet, so you could draw a mop, and the mop is getting up the mess. See? And then the cup is on the counter, ready to be cleaned. I got to clean my cup. Clean up the mess. That's the resolution, right? Clean it up. Now it's nice and shiny. Look at that. Sparkling, really a nice floor. There we go. So that's a resolution. Now in your story, if you do a personal narrative, you can have a problem and a resolution. It makes the story really interesting. So start thinking about that. We're not going to write that today, but if you're going to write a story about your life, personal narrative, what would you talk about? And who would be in the story? And where would it be? And what would be the problem? Is there a problem and a solution that you found? What would that be? Okay. All right, boys and girls.